Now, welcome to the next video. In the next two slides, we're going to discuss what is a pro scout's job. Okay, now this is again a two-part question because there's different types of scouting. Okay, there's identifying the next talent, which would be between the U13 and U17 age group, or a current pro that is better than the current group of players who can make a difference. And this would be somebody that's usually 23 plus. Now, there are going to be exceptions to this because obviously you could find a next talent that's from U9 to U12. But really, there's a lot of variability with that. But as I mentioned before, and this ties back into the window of visibility, based on current FIFA rules, as of U14, that's when the kilometer radius, so to speak, opens up for clubs in Europe and South America to start having a wider range of a player access pool, which means they can start pulling players from a further distance, which is why this is talking about identifying the next talent between U13 and U17, because they need to have those players scouted already prior to that opening for them to identify players. Okay, now, like I said, there's going to be exceptions to this because there's going to be players that are between 18 and 22 that are going to have talent that maybe are in non-league football or amateur football or whatever the circumstances, and they're not being scouted yet. But that's part of the process. So from a general overview, it's going to be the next talent, U13 to U17, and then pro players that can make a difference, which would be 23 plus. Now, again, you're going to have exceptions to this rule because you're going to have players like Martial who signed at a young age for Manchester United and went overseas. Right? He left France to go to Man United at a young age, 20, 21 years old. So again, there's going to be less than that. But it's not that often that happens. Right? It's very rare. That's why you see players like Jadon Sancho, high profile. Mbappe, high profile. Right? It doesn't happen all that often because it usually happens at a younger age or when they get a little bit older. But there are exceptions to the rule. Okay? Now, really, the next step to really identify is what are pro scouts looking for? And it kind of relates back to what we just discussed, but the first one is obviously a future talent. Somebody that is a 1% player that can make a huge impact in the future or relatively soon. Okay? Then the second side would be finding the two best players within a specific positional need for their club. Right? So if the club needs a left wing, the scout is going to go find, for the pro team I'm talking about, the scout is going to find the two best players they can in that position. And it depends on the level of the club, understand. If we're talking about Real Madrid, then they're going to find the two best players in the world. Right? If we're talking about, let's say, Charlton Athletic, they're going to find somebody that's probably a little bit less scaled. Okay, maybe they find an academy player and pull them up, as an example. Okay, and that can be an academy player from another club. It just depends on the club and their size, but they're going to try and find the two best players within a specific positional lead. Okay. The third criteria would really be players that are identified based on performance, because performance at the end of the day is the most important aspect. Because if you don't have performance, obviously you're not going to win. And at the pro level, winning is the most important thing. Because in most countries, there's promotion and relegation. So if you're not winning and you're losing, you're going to get relegated. Clubs can't be relegated. They can't afford to be relegated. So players need to be able to perform. It's high pressure scenarios. Now, here's what we really need I really need you to understand. If you're going to make it at a pro club, you need to be recommended by a scout as a top performer. We've had this information verified by two separate scouts in France. And what it comes down to being is if you're not ranked as a number 1 or number 2 player, you're not going to make it at that club, right? Let's say they have a list of 10 players. And this is something that's replicatable at the pro level all the time, because you'll see and you'll hear about clubs that will have a transfer list for number 9s, and they'll have 1 through 10. Well, they're going to look at and try and get the number 1 and number 2. If they can't get those two players, they're probably not going to sign a long-term target, right? So that premise is very, very important. And you need to ask yourself this question. If you are not a top performer domestically, how can you make it in Europe? If you're not going out and dominating the field every time you step on, how do you think you're going to make it in Europe where the level's only going to be higher? Okay, now there are going to be times that things don't go your way for sure. We understand that. But you need to be dominating and be a top performer week in, week out before we can even talk about playing overseas because the level's only going to be higher. Okay, hopefully that makes more sense to you about their job in general and gives you more insight into what it really takes to play at the professional level.